Hi, my name is Katie Magoon, and I'm the owner of People Solutions Center. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about developing an HR strategy. With over 20 years of HR experience, I've had the opportunity over the past 5 years to build a consulting firm that helps companies figure out how to go from simple compliance all the way to a strategic HR initiative. I'm excited to walk you through that process today so you can work within your organization to make sure that you're headed in the right direction, and more importantly, you know which direction that might be. So over the last year, many of us have spent time feeling like we're simply putting out fires from an HR perspective. The world changed in 2020, and we needed to be in a position to react quickly to all of the things that were happening on a daily basis. So now is a perfect time to step back and see the forest for the trees and really understand what is our path forward as we start to move into the next 1, 2, and even 3 years from an HR perspective. When your HR initiatives align with the business goals, you move from an HR perspective of compliance to really being able to be strategic about where you're headed. But sometimes that's not so easy. We often feel like we're running in circles, or we simply don't have a clear direction on where we need to go. Today's conversation is fully intended to help you navigate those waters and give you clear steps to moving from that forest fire all the way to a clear direction to get you through the maze of the next 3 years. Now, a couple of things to remember as we go through this. First of all, I'd love to chat with you. So I'm here virtually and I'm available in the chat. If you have questions, if you have comments, please take a moment to type those in. I'd love to hold a conversation, even if we're doing it virtually, to make sure that this is an experience you walk away with practical knowledge and tips that you can put on the job right away. So let's get started. The first step in building your HR strategy is to go through what we refer to as a SWOT analysis. Now, many of you may have heard of SWOT analysis, but we're going to take some time to dive deep and figure out how does this apply specifically from an HR perspective. But let's take a minute to step through this, just in case you're not familiar with the concepts of SWOT, or sometimes they're taught a little bit differently, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page. First of all, SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The idea of a SWOT analysis is that you go through every part of your employee life cycle and look at it through the lens of, is this a strength? Is this a weakness? Is it an opportunity? Or is it a threat? Now, when we think about these things, it's really important that we are all talking from the same terminology. Strengths is pretty obvious. What are the things we're really good at? And how would we leverage them going forward? Weaknesses, on the other hand, are those things that we're not as good at, we're not particularly strong in. What are the things that are potentially holding us back from achieving those great results? Here's where it gets a little tricky. The definition of opportunities and threats sometimes gets changed from organization to organization, so I want to be really clear on how we're going to use them in today's context. First of all, opportunities. Opportunities aren't just things that we could be better at. Opportunities are things that might be happening in the external marketplace that could impact your ability to achieve business results. And in this case, it's those things that could happen externally in the business market that increase your chance of having a positive outcome. So, for example, if your competitor down the street goes out of business, that may be an opportunity for you to bring on new and top talent for your organization. Something good that happens in the market that increases your chances of getting great business results. Threats, on the other hand, are still things that are happening externally to your organization, but they don't have the positive outcome that an opportunity may have. Let me give you an example. I had a client a couple of years ago that we were taking through a SWOT analysis from an HR perspective. And we had lots of strengths to be able to build off of. There were a few areas that they felt they were particularly weak on that we knew we had to focus on. But as we walked through with the board of directors what the SWOT analysis looked like, we realized that there was one key threat that actually had an interesting impact on the people side of the house. This organization was actually a soccer organization, and they owned a field right off of a large river. And during our conversation with the board members, one of the board members said, that river has the opportunity to flood on a regular basis. And in fact, this year's looking a little dicey. Most of the time, we would not think of a river flood as an HR threat. If it flooded, it made a difference in how much staffing they would need for the organization for the summer. It was a significant threat. Now, on the downside, the river flooded that year. But the good news was they had already had the conversations about how they would handle things from a staffing perspective. They knew in advance whether or not they would give people paid time off, what additional staffing they would need to help recover the fields in a fast enough manner to be able to finish out the season. They were able to react more quickly because they had thought about this threat in advance. Again, an opportune moment to realizing how effective this SWOT analysis can be in your short-term and your long-term planning. The idea behind this SWOT analysis is we're going to walk through every component of your employee experience. And we're going to look at this through a couple of different lenses. First of all, from an employee perspective, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Second one, from a hiring manager's perspective, from your leadership team's point of view, what are your HR strengths? What are your HR weaknesses? What are opportunities from a people side that you could potentially take advantage of that could help them achieve business results? And are there any threats lurking out there that could really cause problems if we don't anticipate them in the future? Then, once you've looked through your employees, you've looked through this from a leadership perspective, now you look through it from the pure HR perspective, your team. If you're an HR department of one, this piece is pretty easy. If you're a larger HR department, you may need to spend a little bit more time with focus groups and gathering information from folks. We're going to talk throughout this presentation about how to get to this information so that it's not just your opinion, but it's opinion of the organization that then allows you to influence others on the strategy that you want to put in place. So let's talk about the key areas as to how we're going to look at the SWOT analysis, because not all SWOT analysis will look the same. The first place to start is from a compliance perspective. Do you have the foundations of compliance in place? We're going to go through this in quite a bit of detail because especially if you're an HR department of one, or what I like to refer to as the HR department of small but mighty, you may have some compliance things that we need to address before we can get into the really strategic HR work. It's important that we have compliance in place. We don't ultimately want to always be the HR police, but without compliance, HR strategic work really starts to fall apart and it won't have the impact that you want it to have. The second piece is what we refer to as foundational HR practices. What are the things that need to happen from a process, policy, and practice perspective that allow the employee experience and the leadership team's experience to be a positive one? And do you have these core pieces in place? This is one step above compliance, but still not all the way to being ready for your HR strategy. That's the third piece, and this is HR excellence. Now, you may have some components of your HR strategy that are ready for HR excellence. You may have others that are still back in HR compliance, and that's okay. The idea is to assess the organization with an eye on these three areas to really think about not just where we are today, but where could we be in the future? When you get to that level and you could envision a future HR state for your organization, now you're thinking strategically. So we're going to dive deep and walk you through all of the different parts of what can happen from an employee experience perspective. We're going to start in compliance because, as I said, if you don't have compliance right, all of the HR excellence in the world isn't going to solve your problem. But if we can get these core pieces of compliance under control, now we can start to do some amazing things within the organization. So we've put together a sample compliance checklist. This is available in the presentation notes, so please feel free to refer to it and use it within your organization. But it's a checklist that I use with new clients to say, do we have these core pieces of compliance taken care of? And do we know that we're comfortable with the underlying HR policies and practices from this perspective? So here's the first question. That employee handbook, have you looked at it in the last 18 months? Dusted it off, read through it from beginning to end. I was just reading a client's handbook yesterday that I wrote myself just 18 months ago. Didn't seem like it was that long ago, but boy, there were already things that needed to be updated and changed. Your employee handbook not only needs to be updated because there's legal changes in the last 18 months, but this little thing called COVID-19 happened, and that has implications to your employee handbook. In addition, there's been court cases and new laws in many states that make a big difference on what you've included in your employee handbook. It's important that you take a look at this. Here's another big thing that's changed. Your HR practices and rules have probably changed, and you may not have updated the book to match. I have clients who have gone remote and are staying remote, but their current telecommuting policy still says it's only on occasion. I have other clients who have made changes around their stay-at-home policy, just even if your kids are sick going forward. They've become more lenient. Their current policies don't reflect that, and they need to, so that new hires have a good understanding of the expectations, and so that existing employees have answers to what are we going to do when life goes back to normal. You may have made a whole lot of other changes. Maybe you needed to put in an HRIS system because at the end of the day, you needed to be sure that employees could get you important documents through technology because they could no longer hand you that piece of paper. All of these things need to be accurate in your employee handbook. Because if you read your employee handbook with a new hire, and as you flip the pages, you're consistently saying things like, oh, that part has changed, but just ignore it, you've undermined the core components of your employee handbook. And now a new hire can say, is that the part I'm supposed to pay attention to or not? So it's really important that we look at this on a regular basis. The second question is, how are those job descriptions looking? Many of you may be asking, job descriptions? What job descriptions? Or maybe that's that cobwebbed piece of paper that you need to pull out of the drawer in order to make sure that you've got that one little piece that you need to move things forward. Job descriptions are critical to an organization. And while we have them under compliance, they actually come into play when we move further down the road into HR foundational work and when we get to HR excellence. So again, compliance isn't just about being the HR police, it's really about understanding how having these pieces in place allow you to be strategic in the future. Your job descriptions need to be not just a list of the 100 things that somebody is responsible for doing, but they need to be clear on bucketing what are the top 3 to 4 priorities for each particular role, and what percentage of time will an employee spend in those different buckets. It's a key way to help you when it comes to FMLA, workers' compensation, and all sorts of issues that can arise on a regular basis. So good job descriptions really, really matter. Employee files. This has become more and more important, particularly as employees are going remote. A lot of us have employee files that are in cabinets that may or may not have a locked cabinet file to them. Well, if you're still dealing in paper, now is the time to start thinking about an HRIS system. The good news is, if you're a small organization, these are now available on a budget, but they can make all the difference in doing things like remote onboarding, ensuring that you don't have to worry about that file cabinet anymore. It allows you to organize an employee's experience from beginning to end and ensure that you have the documentation you need without all the hassle of that regular employee file audit that you may be doing today if you're in a paper world. Then we start moving into things like employment posters. Do you have them posted? Have you thought about where they're going to be posted now that COVID has hit and your folks are working remotely? Also, do you have state or local laws that you need to worry about compliance with? If so, be sure you're familiar with them and go through and double check to make sure that you've covered your bases from a compliance perspective. And then we have these pesky I-9 forms. I was very surprised after 20 years in corporate HR when I started working with smaller organizations. I-9 forms are often not handled correctly. We think we're doing the right thing, but the reality is there's some things that we need to know. First of all, I-9 forms need to be separate files. Cannot have them in with the employee file. Secondly, you have to make sure you're filling it out correctly. And you're thinking, Katie, this is not a hard document. But I will tell you, probably 4 out of every 10 employers that I work with are not filling out the I-9 form correctly. So it's important that you do an I-9 audit to be sure you've got this piece right. One of the most common mistakes that I see is the individual who is signing the I-9 form is not the same person who actually saw the employee's documents. That's a big risk for your organization, and you need to make sure you've updated your I-9 process so that if I'm the signature, I also am the person who actually saw the documents in the first place. There's a couple of really important pieces that are challenging when it comes to I-9 forms. So you need to make sure you've got a good understanding of the law and that your processes and practices follow that so that your managers also know exactly what they need to do to be in compliance. I've included in this presentation some links to some key checklists that will help you figure out where you may have compliance risks within your organization. It's important to take time to go through these and really understand the impact that compliance can have on your day-to-day practices. Now, in addition to these resources, we do have to step back and think about, are there new pieces coming? COVID-19 has really brought about new changes for organizations, and you need to make sure that you're aware of COBRA compliance issues, whether or not you have all of the documentation you need from an FFCRA perspective. There's lots of things that changed in the last year, and you'll want to make sure that you've met all of the compliance requirements across the board. So, we've gotten through compliance. Phew, thank goodness we got that done. It's not where we like to spend a lot of time from an HR perspective. But when you have that foundation in place, now you can really start to think about, how do we make our HR practices really work for our employees and for our leadership team so that we can be focused on getting business results and approaching our people policies from a really cool and different way. So, what are those foundational HR practices that we need to worry about? Again, we go back to employee life cycle. This is a perfect opportunity to talk about, what do we mean about this employee life cycle? Employee life cycle starts even before somebody is ever an employee. And it's all of the different points in the process where we have an impact on our leadership team and on our employees. It also includes our candidates, because hopefully, eventually, some of them become employees. And so it's really important that we've got a good understanding of, what does it feel like to be part of these different processes? Again, we look at this from 3 different perspectives. First of all, as the employee or the candidate. Second of all, as a member of the leadership team, what do these processes feel like, and what works and what doesn't work? And the third piece, as an HR professional on your team. Are things streamlined? Are they easy to get done? Do they free you up to do way more strategic work? These are all the kinds of things that we want to think about as we evaluate, are these areas strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats? Now, I want to take a moment before we jump into this and remind you, I'm here in the chat. So please take time to talk to me about, even from a compliance perspective, what were some of the things that you thought of that were strengths of your organization? Or where do you maybe have a threat or even a weakness that you need to approach from a compliance side of the house? If you have questions, please throw those in the chat as well. I'd love to be able to provide you some follow-up information. And as it goes for those links that I shared, don't worry, they're not just in the presentation. I'm going to throw those in the chat right now as well, so that you can copy and paste any of the ones that you might want, so you can go refer to some of the key resources that we've provided during this conversation. So let's dive into this life cycle process and really think about, what does this all mean? Workforce planning. Now, I've been in recruiting for most of my career. I spent 12 years as the recruiting director for Progressive Insurance in what they called high volume recruiting. And let me tell you, if anybody ever puts the term high volume in your job title, you might want to run really, really fast, because it means you're going to be really, really busy. But workforce planning is so, so critical, and yet it's the piece that a lot of organizations don't do well. Some of you are thinking, what the heck even is it? Because to be honest, I've never seen somebody actually plan out what was going to happen with my workforce. This is your opportunity to really stop and think about, how do we know how many folks we're going to need next year and what that talent is going to need to look like? So if you have a strong workforce planning process, now it sets you up to be way more strategic about your recruiting decisions and your recruiting strategies. So let's ask ourselves, do we know how many people our organization is going to hire in the next year? And do we know in what job titles? Now, if you're asking yourself, where would I even begin to get that information? I've got a couple of ideas for you. Typically, if you're even in a smaller organization, your chief financial officer has a general idea of what the growth is going to be over the next year. And if you can build a strategic partner with that individual, a conversation around, what do you expect growth to look like and where do we think that will have impacts on staffing, is really critical. The other place you can get this information is to look at your own turnover data. Which of the roles in your organization are most likely to turn over, and therefore you'll need backfills? Also, promotional information is helpful because if you always promote from the entry-level position in your organization, you better make sure you've got a pipeline for that particular role. Taking a look at workforce planning from beginning to end and understanding what this is going to look like for an organization is critical. Talk about succession planning. I had a client just last week. I've known him for 2 years, and since I met him, he's been telling me that one day the individual that does their payroll and basic bookkeeping was going to retire. She's been with the organization for 30 years. She knows everything in terms of how they do payroll and the historical reasons why they do things the way that we do. We've been talking for the last 2 years about what does the plan look like to replace her, and more when she does retire, and more importantly, how do we make sure that this job is easier when she leaves? Because man, she is super, super smart, and she's got this all down. But training it all to a new hire would be really, really difficult because they don't have any automation, and they're not leveraging technology. Lo and behold, January 5th, she walked in the door and said, "I'm so excited to tell you, this is the year I'm retiring." Luckily for us, she gave a year's notice, and we had already started implementing an HRIS system that's going to streamline their payroll, their benefits, and all of the places that they now have paper files in order to make sure that everything can be done online. It's this kind of workforce planning that sets you up for long-term success when you've got time to think about it ahead of time. So again, question becomes, would workforce planning fall under a strength, a weakness, an opportunity, or a threat for your organization? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, so throw those in the chat and tell me a little bit about why. It'll give us, all of the participants, an idea of what are some of the things folks are doing really well, and also where might you be running into challenges. If you don't have a workforce plan today, don't worry. It's as easy as starting some conversations with folks and getting people thinking about why this is so important. So let's move to the next step of our employee life cycle, employment branding and recruiting. How do we look in the market when it's time to bring new hires to the table? So here's a key question. Do you have a sourcing plan? Do you know the roles in your organization from your workforce plan that you need to hire for? And have you thought about how you're going to bring those individuals to the table? Now, if you're hiring just 1 or 2 people in a particular job title, you may not need a particularly exorbitant sourcing strategy. If you have to hire 15, 20, 25, you might want to think more strategically about where these individuals are going to come from. Also, do you have a defined selection process? Do your managers know exactly what needs to happen in order for an individual to come from, I have your resume, to I walked in your door? And does that process make sense and work effectively to ensure you have the highest quality of candidates? From a recruiting side, have you set what your service level agreements are going to be with your hiring managers? And if so, are they clear on something that everybody really is on board with, or are they just information that we've written down but nobody's really tracking or measuring? Now we get to the selection side of the house. When a candidate goes through your process, is it a process that's consistent from one manager to the next? And do you have any compliance issues here you need to think about? Are people asking the right questions to ensure that you've got a strong quality of candidate? This comes down to having really strong interview guides that help a manager figure out what are the competencies that are most important for the job, and how do I figure out if the candidate has those competencies or skill sets? We'll talk more about this as we get to some concepts around unconscious bias and some trends that we're seeing in the market around interviewing. Also, are your interviewers trained? Not just from a compliance perspective of knowing what is or isn't legal to ask, but also do they understand behavioral-based interviewing so that they can get the best possible results? And does that mean they also understand the impact on your diversity and inclusion efforts to make sure that the organization is really bringing the top talent to the group? And then the last one, which is a biggie, candidate experience. Would your candidates refer a friend, even if they weren't hired? Your ability to retain employees starts at the point that somebody is a candidate. If I have a great candidate experience, I start the job thinking this is a great place to work. And even if things get a little rocky in onboarding, I'm already bought in. If I start out and my candidate experience was poor and people didn't call me back, or maybe I had a bad experience in the interview, I may take the job, but I may take it with a little bit of hesitation. And then when things get bumpy, I'm quick to think about whether or not this was the right decision. So it's important, regardless of the labor market, that we have an amazing candidate experience where people feel like they're really valued throughout the process. So let's talk about a couple of best practices as it relates to this HR foundational area of recruiting strategies. First of all, we talked about branding. Do you write job ads or do you just publish job descriptions? Job ads are much more of a marketing tool. They highlight the culture. They tell a candidate, what's in it for me? You need to think about posting job ads that really pull people in and attract the right talent to your organization, as opposed to the old boring, here's the job description that we've always used. Think about leveraging video. Video is one of the newest ways to engage candidates. And it doesn't have to be difficult or even high tech. But employee testimonials that are done via video give you the opportunity to market the positions, put it on your website, get client testimonials from time to time about what it's like to work with your employees and why you're such a great organization to work with. And most importantly, if you get the chance to make a day in the life video for a position that you hire for all the time, you should just snatch this up. It is an amazing way to make sure that candidates have a good idea of exactly what experience they're going to have once they start. You can use these videos on your website, you can put them on YouTube and use them through your social media marketing. There's all sorts of ways to leverage this information. But get candidates excited about starting also gives you one more touch point to make sure that people know exactly what they're walking into with your culture and the role that you're recruiting for. Next piece, consider targeted strategies. If you need to do a lot of hiring, have good plans around college recruiting, vocational schools, military recruiting. This isn't just for sheer numbers though, it also helps you with your diversity initiatives. So think about, do we have targeted strategies and how well are we doing at carrying those out? Again, this is all part of your SWOT analysis of things to think about as you're evaluating whether these are strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats. Then you've got to make sure you've got your consistent process. Does everyone understand their roles and responsibilities in the recruiting process? Also setting timelines in advance. This can be huge. Candidate experience gets drug out and really, really painful when we haven't agreed with hiring managers up front. When are we going to do the next round of interviews? Let's get that date scheduled on the calendar. Let's get all the candidates bunched into a small couple of days, maybe even just a one-day set of interview days, so that you see all candidates on the same day, and now we're ready to make decisions. These are some of the things that you can do to streamline your process and ensure you've got a fantastic candidate experience with clear expectations. We talked a little bit about interviewing. And if you feel like your interviewers are saying things like, what should I ask? And how do I know if I have the right answer? You're simply rolling the dice when it comes to your hiring decisions. Making sure that you've got best practices in the selection process are key. So there's new technology out there that will allow you to create interview guides that are behavioral-based guides, customized for every position in your organization. Tell me about a time when. Give me an example of. Is all of the key to understanding how past behavior can predict an employee's future behavior going forward. It's really important that we get a good understanding of what this is. And if you've got more questions on this technology, don't hesitate to just reach out. I've got a few different options in this, including one I happen to love, which is Interview Path. But it really can make all the difference in the quality of your hiring decisions. And then you gotta train your managers. Having the right question of tell me about a time when only does you so much good. You need to know what answers you're listening for. And asking follow-up questions is a key component to this. The other piece you need to understand is, have we defined the competencies, skills, and motivations for the job? If we don't know what it is we look for in a great hire, how are we ever gonna know when we found it? So, coming up with these competencies and getting buy-in from your hiring managers is critical. This includes this concept of motivational fit. Do your managers understand what it means when they say, they just weren't a good fit? Usually we're referring to, there's something in my gut that's not sitting right. What we actually need to understand is, how does the candidate's likes and dislikes match up with how often they're going to do certain things in our company? Do they do it a lot, or do they never get to do it? Because boy, if I like doing something and I get to do it all the time, I'm gonna be super happy. But if I hate doing something and I have to do it all the time, I might not stick around very long. You can see how this grid is going to work in terms of determining whether or not somebody is really the right fit for the organization, not because they look like us or they act like us, but because they like the kinds of things that they're going to see within the organization. It's a great concept as we start to think about this important piece called unconscious bias. So I'm going to put this slide up here on the screen, and I want you to take about 15 seconds to look at this picture. And while you're looking at the picture, I want you to identify everything pink. Everything in the picture that's pink, make a mental list. Start to think about as many pink things as you can possibly think of. I'm going to give you a few more seconds to look at this. And again, tell me all the pink things. I'm going to actually start to ask you to write in the chat, how many pink things did you come up with? Now, I'm going to ask you a couple of key questions about this picture. Keep writing in the chat how many things you came up with, but also give me the answers to these key questions. What was on the floor at the foot of the bed? What two items were on the dresser at the foot of the bed? What was on the floor in front of the window? And what two items are on the bed? Throw your answers into the chat. And more importantly, tell me how you did on this exercise. Were you thinking, 4 for 4, that was easy, Katie, why are we doing this? I got some, but not all. And then my favorite and most common answer, was I even looking at the right picture? This is an important concept of unconscious bias. So, now some of you may want to know those answers, and so I'll give you a quick refresh. What was on the floor at the foot of the bed is this panda bear. What is on the dresser at the end of the bed is a picture frame and a lamp. On the floor in front of the window is a vase with flowers, and on the bed is a laptop and a phone or a pillow and a blanket. All of these tend to work. It's important that you understand why, for some of you, this exercise was super hard. I told you to look for everything pink, right? I put a filter over your eyes that allowed only the pink things to come through. This is essentially what's happening in interviewing when we have unconscious bias. Things that we don't even realize we have a filter for are only allowing certain pieces of information to get through. So the question becomes, do your interviewers know that every human being has unconscious bias? It doesn't make us good or bad, it's just called being human, because there's too much information in the world for us to take in without these filters. But have you trained your managers on what that means? Again, this idea that you make 11 judgments about somebody in the first 7 seconds you meet them is critical as you're thinking about whether or not your hiring managers are appropriately trained to get the outcomes in the interview process that you need. So you may be asking yourself, well, now what do I do? How do we make sure that we overcome this area of opportunity if it's a challenge for you? It's really important that you do training and help your managers really increase their self-awareness to understand hidden biases. Because one, when we start to uncover what our biases are and talk about them, we do a better job of opening up those filters. And then we use behavioral interview guides to help us really focus our questions on the competencies and skills needed to do the job so that we get information from the candidate that can give us the stories we need to know whether or not they're the right hire. And it helps us overcome our unconscious bias, both our positive and our negative. Unconscious bias training is key to making sure that you've got a great selection process. So make sure you put down on your SWOT analysis where this falls in terms of strength, a weakness, an opportunity, or a threat. Again, I'm going to take a moment here to remind you, please put some stuff in the chat. Let me know where that area of selection and branding fell in terms of your strengths or opportunities. If you've got a best practice, please take a moment to type that in as well. I'm sure our other participants would love to hear, what are you doing that's really working well in this area? So let's talk onboarding. Onboarding is that moment from when you've made the offer to an employee all the way to, we kind of think of onboarding as sort of the first 6 months of an employee's life cycle. And the question becomes, do you have a consistent process? Are roles and responsibilities well defined? And how are you tracking whether or not it's working? Now remember, we said onboarding is a defined process. It's not just day one. It starts prior to the start date, and there's things that are really helpful and effective if you do that at each of the key critical points of an onboarding plan. But what are they? It's your job as an HR professional to figure out what are the right steps that need to be taken and who's responsible for doing them. And then following up to make sure that that process is really easy for people to follow and it's effective in getting the outcomes you're looking for. So here are a couple of best practices. First of all, welcome calls. Between the time you make the offer and the day this person's showing up for their first day, has anybody talked to your candidates? A lot of times we make the offer and then we're so busy getting ready for the candidate that we forgot to call and say, hey, we're excited to see you on Monday, which makes Sunday night that much more unnerving for them when they're not really sure if you remembered that they're supposed to show up the next day. Talk about the plan for the week. Tell them what to do about lunch. All of the basics happen in this welcome call, but it starts to build trust between the hiring manager, HR, and your new employee. Now there's lots of different ways that can look, and who does it and who's responsible can vary from organization to organization, but make it work for you. Make sure you've got ways to introduce the team and key people, not just in the first day. Yes, we walk them around, we give them a tour, we give introductions, but does anybody really remember somebody you met on the first day? Not likely. So make ongoing contact with folks so they have an opportunity to really start to build trust and relationships with the key people that they need to work with every day. And when we have friends at work, we're happier at work. So who's taking this individual to lunch for a while? How do they get to know people that they're going to work with? Especially in a virtual world, this becomes really important. We have to remember that we used to just take people to lunch or sit down at the lunch table. And how do you make that happen in a virtual world can get really creative. So think about whether or not you've got a good plan. Leveraging technology to reduce paperwork. How many of you might still be trying to fill out tax forms in paper version? And in remote world, that's been really hard. Make sure that they can get all of the online work that they need completed without ever having to touch a piece of paper. Tax documents, benefits enrollment, all of this should be streamlined and online to make sure you've got a great employee experience and to make your life a lot easier so you can spend time on strategy. Think about DISC assessments. Myers-Briggs, DISC, all of these personal styles can really help your onboarding process because they speed up the time that it takes individuals to build trust with one another. This allows managers and employees to build strong coaching relationships from the beginning. It's an amazing way to onboard a team. I recently had an example of a startup company where we started DISC assessments with the very first hire, and every employee that they've hired, and they're now up to 65 folks, every single person has had a DISC assessment, and we've made it part of the culture in terms of talking to each other when they onboard so that they have a good understanding about how to best communicate with one another. It's an amazing way to bring this to life and really make it a core part of your culture and help avoid some of the pitfalls that can happen when you're building relationships with new folks. Make sure to build in regular check-ins. 30, 60, 90 days are all good opportunities to say, hey, how's it going? Are we living up to the promises that we made in your onboarding plan? Again, take a moment here and let me know, is your onboarding plan a strength, a weakness, an opportunity, or a threat? How you doing? It's a good idea to think about some of the best practices and share those with the groups as well. So let's move to development and performance management. This is the concepts that go along with, are you providing people feedback? Are you giving coaching on a regular basis? Or do you simply wait for once a year and develop this document that is a performance evaluation that nobody wants to do in the first place? Are people actually even having conversations that are equivalent to feedback to make sure that development is happening? Do you have a mindset of manage, or are your leaders in the mode of coaching? And thinking about where are they spending their time? Do they spend 80% of the time as managers? Or do they spend 80% of their time as coaches? It's an amazing concept when you bring this to an organization and you really ask folks, where are they spending their time? Most leaders haven't spent much time talking about this at all. But shifting your mindset from manager to coach is huge. And then create a culture of coaching, a culture where every individual is responsible for giving and receiving feedback. That it supports stretch thinking and thinking outside of the box to come up with new ideas and to challenge our development at every stage. It's two-way conversations. It's not a long document that gathers cobwebs. It's discussions about what are you doing well and where you maybe need some opportunity to develop for that next step. These are the skills that go with coaching. So ask yourself, do your leaders do these things? Do they need development in order to make sure that they have these coaching skills? And again, I keep talking about that long performance evaluation document that we all hate. When we're coaching, we get rid of the performance evaluation that's about looking in the rearview mirror. Instead, we start looking out the windshield at what should this individual start, stop, and continue doing. We have frequent conversations, not long documents. And the conversations are meaningful and impactful because they talk about what you want me to do in the future. Now I've engaged you in coaching discussions, and the world starts to change. So let's talk about the last piece of the employee life cycle, the exit interview. We hope it never happens, but it will. So, do you have a format for your exit interview process? Are you gathering feedback and trends from the folks that you're losing to really understand what's going on in the organization? Also, do you have HR technology that supports these processes in a way that are effective? To again, streamline from beginning to end your entire employee life cycle so that it's easy for an employee as they're walking out the organization to still have the documents that they need. Think about HR technology at every stage of this employee life cycle, and if you're going, I don't have any, don't be overwhelmed by that concept. There are all sorts of ways to get great HR technology on a budget today. You just have to know where to look. If you've got questions on HR technology, feel free to put those in the chat as well. I'd be happy to answer questions around some of the ideas that we've used with clients of all sizes to really make this effective. Some of the evaluation tools. So you're thinking, okay, Katie, that was a lot of information, and I'm supposed to do a SWOT analysis on all of this? How do I even start? The first thing you need to do is figure out where you're going to get all of this input from. Employee and manager focus groups can be super helpful in completing your SWOT analysis. Candidate experience surveys. Get feedback from the folks that have been through your process. Do hiring manager surveys. That'll give you a good idea of what's happening on the recruiting side of the house. New hire surveys. At about the 90-day mark, ask folks, how are we doing? Did we get it right? Are we following the plan? And then your exit interview surveys will also give you great information for your SWOT analysis. So, we've got compliance, we've got foundational processes. Now we're really rocking and rolling. It's time to start thinking about HR excellence. HR excellence is about the strategic things that you're able to do that go beyond just my processes work, but really take you to aligning with business results. This is where we can envision a future state for HR and make all the difference. So, what is this whole HR excellence thing again? HR excellence starts to happen when we align our HR practices with our mission. When HR and people, processes, and policies come together to help get us the business results that we need. They also help us solve organizational challenges. Maybe it's a new structure. Maybe it's about thinking about the structure we have today is working, but 3 years down the road, it's going to start to get messy. Maybe 3 years down the road, your key person is going to retire, and you need to think about what the new organizational structure will look like. Are you ready for that? And do you have the plan in place for figuring out who's going to be prepared to step into that role? HR excellence ideas can also start to improve employee retention. They take you to better results. Again, we're past compliance, we're past just basic process. Now we're into what could we really do that's new and different. I had a client the other day whose owner really wanted to start pulling back from the day-to-day business practices, and he didn't want to be everybody's go-to for every answer. But what he wanted to make sure happened was that the culture that he built stayed a core part of the organization. So he had this idea of, well, I'll go out in the field and work with people a couple of times a week, and that means they'll get to know me all the time, and then I'll be the person that sets the culture. The challenge with that plan was that his operations manager would be chasing after him, trying to undo decisions that people thought he had made while he's out in the field working with people one-to-one. So he came up instead with a new plan, and he's in love with the idea. Instead of just randomly working in the field 2 or 3 days a week, his role will be to go through, as part of the onboarding process, be in the field with a new hire in their first week, be in the field with them for a couple of hours, talking about the company and his vision and where he wants it to go while they're working. Take them to lunch, get to know them. Then again, at about the 30-day mark, he's going to do it again and check in. How's it going? What do you like? Do you have any feedback for me? He's got this great personality that is just somebody that everybody wants to open up to. So it's a wonderful way for him to be engaged with people without driving the operations manager crazy on a day-to-day basis. So it would be being strategic about how that onboarding process could look to make sure we're retaining our new hires. Increase employee engagement and results. What are you doing to bring the level up a little bit? Not just what are we doing to get by, to make sure we've checked all the boxes, but how do we move things forward in a really cool way to envision a future state for our organization? That's when we get to HR excellence. A couple of ideas on strategies can come from employee engagement surveys. Getting feedback from your folks and understanding how are they feeling today, and how does that fit into where you need them to be in the future. Doing things like leadership assessments and development plans. Leadership assessment tools are super helpful in understanding your leaders. How are they doing today, and what development do they need along the way? Building employee development programs. How do you help that new hire get all the way from new hire to manager? And what tools will they have along the way so that they're not just the manager because they happen to be the person who's been there the longest, or maybe they're the most frequent person to show up on a daily basis, but because they have the skills and they're ready to leverage those skills as a leader. And then succession planning. Making sure you've got a plan for the future and you know who your key players are so that you can get ahead of the retention and make sure that when folks do decide to retire or they get promoted, you've got a plan to make sure the next person is ready to step into those shoes. Other ideas for HR excellence strategies are things like wellness programs, rewards and recognition programs, employee branding strategies. Again, it's beyond sourcing. Now it's about what's our employment brand. And continuity planning. What happens if all of a sudden we have to go remote immediately overnight? Can we keep our businesses going? What adjustments would need to be made? Some of us may have realized that after a year of fighting that fire, we probably need a better continuity plan for going forward. And what role does HR play in that as we think about things that could happen in the future? So we've got all of these pieces and parts. We've done our SWOT analysis. Congratulate yourself. And I'd love to keep hearing from you in the chat about what were some of your key takeaways on the HR excellence side of the house, areas where you go, wow, we could really do some cool stuff. So you've got your SWOT analysis done. Step 2 is build the plan. Building the plan means you've got to prioritize all of those projects that you probably came up through your SWOT analysis. When we prioritize projects, we tend to think of them in 3 key buckets. First of all, what are those quick knockouts? What can we just take off the list because it's low-hanging fruit and it's easy to do? These are typically things that can be done in the first 1 to 6 months. Often they're compliance related. They may not always be, but if it's compliance based, you need to make sure this isn't a quick hit item because compliance matters, and so you've got to get it done quickly. Also, this may be something that's just a quick win. It's easy enough to do, and boy, would our employees be happy if we did it. And if you don't need a lot of resources, it's easier to put these things in sort of this POW bucket where stuff can happen fast and you can make an impact. The second category of our plan are those projects that are sort of short-term goals. It might take us 6 to 18 months to get them done. Oftentimes, this is where your foundational process changes will fall in terms of your plan or your strategy. This one may start to require additional resources. If you're a small HR department, that small HR department of one or mighty, you may find this is where you need to pull somebody in from the outside, or maybe a resource from another part of the company who can get you the information and the expertise you need. Now, the other reason that something could end up in this short-term goals bucket is if you know you've got to do a lot of change management. You don't want to pull the rug out from underneath people because you won't get the change implemented and sticky the way you want it. So put it in a short-term bucket and think about how do you not only get the work done, but how do you change perspectives to make sure that people will buy into the change you put in place. The third piece of your HR strategy are your long-term goals. What are those things that are on the horizon for the next 18 months to 3 years? The idea here is by not just focusing on what do I need to do today, but also where are we going 3 years from now, it gives you the ability to influence your business partners at every single stage. Because you can say, this is why this compliance thing that you're not really excited about today matters. Because if we do this, it sets us up 3 years from now to be able to do this. And you're going to be amazed on how that can start to change the perspective when you have compliance stuff you've got to address, but you're showing that you're thinking strategically in the long run for really cool HR projects. So often these things you need something foundational to be completed before you can move into this bucket. You may be in a situation where this is going to require a lot of resources, and so you have to plan either from a budget perspective or a capacity perspective to get these things done. But go through all of the projects that came out of your SWOT analysis and figure out which of these 3 buckets do they fall into. The next step is to think about, now who's going to do the work? There's 2 different buckets that this tends to fall into. First of all, the DIY bucket, do it yourself. What are the things that you can do internally that you don't need any resources for? These are things where you are the subject matter expert, or maybe you have the subject matter expert in-house. The other piece is sometimes, even if you don't have that expertise, there's enough about the culture where somebody internally really needs to be the person to build it. These are key reasons to keep some of this work in-house. And all of your projects can benefit when you can do some of them in-house within yourself. But don't be afraid to realize when you need resources, particularly if you're a department of one or a department of small but mighty. You may need help figuring out how to get some of these things done. So here are some reasons that it makes sense to go externally to get some of that support. And this could be externally with vendors that you're already in partnership with. It could be consultants that have an area of expertise that maybe don't have in-house, or just bringing in extra resources from a capacity perspective to help lift up your team and give them the amount of capacity you need to get projects completed. So resource constraints is a big one, first and foremost. If you're a small but mighty HR department, you may not have enough in-house people to get all of the projects done you want in the time frame you want. And so it's a good reason to influence folks to use external resources. You can get things done faster, which allows you to make a bigger impact on the business results. Also, external vendors bring a subject matter expertise. Not only can they deep dive into their areas of expertise, but they also can give you ideas of how something might look across a variety of different vendors. We have some clients that use us simply because they want to call us and say, what's everybody else doing? What have you seen work? What struggles are you seeing when people do this? It's that ability to have experiences across a wide range of industries, of a wide range of competitors, to get some knowledge around what's working and what's not. And the third piece is certainly sometimes you need the trust of an outside person. Boy, was it frustrating to me when I was in corporate world, and the thing I had been saying over and over and over again, nobody would make a move on. But lo and behold, here would come a vendor or a consultant, and they'd be like, well, you should do this. And everybody immediately went, oh, that's the smartest thing I've ever heard of. And oh, you wanted to pull the hair out of your head. I know the feeling. But if you're smart, you can also use that same frustration to be one of your biggest wins. Because sometimes we do trust advisors outside of the organization because they have other experiences besides our own. And if you're the one to bring that trusted advisor to the table to help influence for the position you think is the right move for the company, that's a win. So know how to use these vendors in a positive way to help reinforce your messages. Don't feel overwhelmed by, well, what if they only listen to him because it's the outside person? Because in your heart of hearts, you know you got the outcome you needed, which is the right way to get the organization moving forward. All right, so we've got a plan, right? We're going to start with our SWOT analysis. Then we're going to decide which are the projects that we need to do for over the next 1 to 3 years. Which ones are quick hits, they can be done today. Which ones are a little bit longer, short-term goals that can be done in about 18 months. And which ones are our long-term visions. This gets you your 1 to 3 year plan. And now you have the opportunity to stop and think, what resources do I need to get it done? And where does it make sense to keep some things in-house? And where do you leverage external resources? Now you have a strategy. And it feels so much better to know where you're going to go. Now I will tell you, there are still going to be days that even with this plan, you're scratching your head going, everything got messed up. But when you have a plan to go back to, it makes it so much faster for you to get back on track when the world gets upheaved and you don't know what happened because you're busy putting out a fire. You now have that plan to go back to immediately and you're not starting from square one. These are all of the reasons that having an HR strategy is so key to really becoming a key player at the table when it comes to business decisions in your organization. Keep going in the chat. If you've got questions, I'm here to answer them for you. I would love to hear your key takeaways as part of this chat. And if you've got a best practice that you haven't had a chance to share yet, please put that in there. Decisions around when you've used external resources that have been particularly helpful. Situations where you think, wow, an external resource could be more useful in the future that might help you get these things accomplished from a plan perspective. We are so excited to be here today to share with you how we've helped clients work through these HR strategies. The great news about HR strategies, though, is this is something that you can each do on your own. It just takes the opportunity to step back. I strongly encourage you to take time to put yourself in a conference room or off-site, somewhere by yourself where you can start by just thinking, how would I answer those SWOT analysis questions? Then go out and get input from all of the key stakeholders that we talked about to fill in the SWOT analysis. But when you take time to do this, it makes all of the difference on how you're able to move forward. We would love to continue to hear from you, whether it's an additional resource you'd like more information on, or you just have questions from today's presentation. Don't hesitate to reach out. I love to network with fellow HR professionals. I may be in the consulting space now, but I've spent over 20 years in human resources and corporate space, and the one thing I wish I had done more of is reach out to fellow HR professionals and build networks and relationships so that I'd have those ways to really connect with people. So take that opportunity now. Connect with me on LinkedIn, send me a follow-up email. Let's just chat about what you've learned today and what changes you're hoping to make in the future. I hope you got a ton out of today's presentation. And most importantly, take time throughout this conference to engage with each other and to think about how do I take all of the new ideas from all of these great presenters and put them into practice. We've all learned a lot, and there's a lot to take back on a day-to-day basis to make a difference so that you can be the HR expert that your organization needs. Thank you so much and have a fantastic day.